Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Andrade, and I'm here with Tony Fitzgerald, Danielle Greer, and Kent Blaser, representing RussiaTeam A. We're here to argue that if we continue with the hawkish policy towards Russia, we will turn our strategic strength in the Ukraine crisis into a global failure. Our significant superiority in the Ukraine crisis enables us to take a long-term view and realize that there is more at stake in the Ukraine crisis than what first meets the eye. First, we have the economies of the United States and Europe. Imposing sanctions on Russia has resulted in significant and unsustainable losses for our European allies. Second, the security of the world is at stake. We need Russia to address the threat of nuclear terrorism, to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda, to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and to stabilize the Middle East. The third matter at stake is the stability of Ukraine and Russia. We need a policy that effectively prevents Putin from making the Donbas war a frozen conflict. We need a policy that reduces the likelihood of Russia lashing out against another country, and a policy that ensures the stability of ex-Soviet states. We currently have an upper hand in the Ukraine crisis. Our military assistance ensured that Ukraine, a country the size of Texas, was able to survive in a war against Russia. Despite many challenges, Ukraine's provisional government held up, and we're now seeing a Ukraine that is defining itself as an independent democratic state. Economic sanctions combined with low oil prices severely hurt the Russian economy. Russia's present economic state now stands as evidence that violation of territorial integrity will not go unpunished. Moreover, because of America's intervention, ex-Soviet states did not lean towards Russia, but instead strengthened their relationships with each other and with the West. So far, our strategy of coercion has placed us in a position of strength, but successful strategies must combine coercion with incentives, sticks with carrots. We have additional stakes in Ukraine that our present strategy fails to secure, and which we must meet through diplomatic action. You will be hearing from my team experts a series of gradual steps that the United States should take under the condition that Russia secures the full implementation of Minsk II, putting an effective ceasefire in the Donbas region. These steps will halt a senseless arms race. They will reduce the likelihood of Russia lashing out against another country. They will ensure the stability of ex-Soviet states, and they will allow American leaders to productively engage with Putin in other pressing international affairs. You have just heard from Team B, a proposal for the continuation of a hawkish stance towards Russia. The problem with this proposal is that it is rooted in a flawed interpretation of the causes of the Ukraine crisis. Team B sees the Ukraine crisis as evidence of Putin acting offensively. They've argued that Putin wants to kind of return Russia to its former USSR glory by conquering ex-Soviet territories. Implicit in this view of events is the notion that Putin went from having little influence in Ukraine to full control, when the fact of the matter is the opposite. Before the crisis, Russia had significant influence in Ukraine through energy dependence and corruption. It was when Putin started losing control over the region that he reacted defensively by taking over Crimea. Team B's policy proposal is also rooted in the failed assumption that a strengthened Russia is more aggressive and threatening to the United States than a weak Russia. Again, the reality is different. Putin reacted defensively to the loss of a strategically and historically important region, a loss that was dangerous precisely because of Russia's weakness. Such a loss would have put Putin's domestic legitimacy at risk, incentivizing the kinds of protests we saw in 2011. Team B has also inflated Russia's threat. In current circumstances, it is impossible for Russia to seek an expansionist grand strategy without overextending itself and destroying its economy. Because it is based on erroneous premises, Team B's proposed strategy is actually counterproductive to America's interests. Pursuing a hawkish policy towards Russia increases the chances that it will lash out defensively. Senseless military buildup increases the chances of mistakes too. We do not want another Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 being shot down, resulting in the unnecessary deaths of almost 300 civilians. Increasing sanctions is costly for the US and its European allies. Moreover, such a move could lead to a dangerous instability within an already weak Russia. These past few weeks, Putin has been making public calls for cooperation with the United States in Syria and in fighting ISIS. This is why we think this is the moment for us to use our position of strength to productively engage with Putin. And now we will hear from Tony, our military expert.
Despite its recent military modernization and adventurism in Eastern Europe, the oft-touted threat of the Russian military is overblown. Their armed forces have been beset by aging technology, budget shortfalls, and their sheer numbers pale in comparison to NATO's. Despite these contingencies, Russia's military strength is not inconsiderable. They maintain a mobilization advantage that NATO would be hard-pressed to counter. However, those that believe Russia is on the verge of a Baltic invasion simply do not understand Russia's military motivations. The US and NATO maintain a significant military advantage over Russia. The greatest strength of Russia's military is in its land forces, which maintain a large arsenal of around 15,000 tanks and 766,000 men. However, the US has twice as many personnel, 1.4 million, and taken all together, NATO has 3,370,000 troops to call upon. Further, NATO and the US maintain important strategic advantages over Russia, particularly our naval and air superiority. We have 20 aircraft carriers to Russia's 1, and that one aircraft carrier is so dilapidated that it travels around with a dedicated tugboat just in case it breaks down. This example is demonstrative of Russia's dated military arsenal. Much of its equipment is left over from the Cold War era, particularly their large ground forces. And though the Kremlin has embarked on a modernization process in recent years, given their deteriorating economy, such an operation is no longer financially viable. As of March 2016, Russia has instituted government cuts of 10% across the board, and the Ministry of Defense has instituted a further 5% reduction in spending, putting the brakes on military modernization. These numbers reveal two things. NATO is the most powerful military alliance that the world has ever seen, but also that Russia's military power, while compromised in a few key areas, is not inconsiderable. And while the numbers are on NATO's side, it is important to concede that Russia maintains a distinct and insurmountable advantage: mobilization. Indeed, the RAND Corporation has found that Putin could take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania quite rapidly using that particular advantage. Team B has told you that military buildup in the Baltics would prevent such a move. However, Russia's mobilization advantage in the region is not so easily combated. The RAND Corporation found that a 4-to-1 NATO to Russian force ratio would be required to defend the Baltics. Thus, further buildup will do nothing but exacerbate tensions in the region. Russia's incursion into Crimea represented the defense of a vital strategic interest for the Kremlin. Crimea contains the port of Sevastopol, which provides Russia's naval access to the Black Sea. This port is of great strategic importance to Russia, particularly in light of their current operations in Syria and the Middle East. And though they could do so, Russia has not invaded the Baltics because it does not suit their interests. Putin is a rational actor who knows that NATO's commitment to Article 5 is not limited to the defending of the Baltics on Baltic soil. Russia knows that NATO is capable of expanding such a clash horizontally and globally, particularly because further military buildup would do little to prevent a Russian invasion. The Kremlin is aware that any action as offensive as taking the Baltics would cripple Russia, not make her stronger. Russia does not want a war with NATO. Their 2014 incursion is indicative not of a strong power on the road to global domination, but of a weakened Russia, looking to shore up its interests in response to Western advancement. Each example of Russia's past adventurism has come on the heels of Western action. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, NATO, a military alliance meant to combat them, has continued to expand. And in 2008, when NATO boldly declared that Georgia and Ukraine will become members, threatening Russia's security in its near abroad, it is hardly surprising that Russia would feel intimidated. Similarly, in 2014, a Ukrainian trade deal with the European Union triggered Russia's Crimea campaign. And again, in response to a NATO missile shield in Romania, whose construction began this year and is currently underway, Russia has threatened the armament of Kaliningrad with tactical nuclear Iskander missiles. Team B has indicated that these incidents represent a pattern of Russian aggression. But in these examples, Russia has reacted in response to NATO's actions, and each time this has resulted in a negative outcome. Aggressive action from NATO simply feeds into Putin's domestic narrative of Western imperialism and drives a vicious circle of escalating tensions without actually enhancing NATO's security in the region. In light of these military considerations, it is vital that the US stop engaging Vladimir Putin on his terms. We are in a position to negotiate from strength, and we must capitalize on it. NATO's recent decision at the Warsaw Summit to deploy more troops to the Baltics will do nothing to aid in the defense of the area and will simply exacerbate the already high tensions between Russia and NATO. The German Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, confirmed this view, saying last month that the one thing we shouldn't do now is inflame the situation with loud saber-rattling and warmongering, and NATO would be well advised not to provide a pretext to renew an old confrontation. Further, this game of chicken that NATO is playing with Russia is simply an unnecessary distraction from more pressing global issues. The alarming increase in terrorist activity, the possibility of nuclear proliferation, particularly to those same terrorists, and the seemingly endless conflict in Syria are all matters of much greater consequence than Russian aggression in their near abroad. In light of these considerations, Team A's military policy suggestions are fourfold. In addition to the policy suggestions of my colleagues, NATO should halt its buildup of troops in Eastern Europe. And while the troop increases promised at the recent Warsaw Summit should go through, NATO should refrain from engaging in further buildup and consider a stepwise rollback of troops should Russia follow through with the following concessions. NATO should secure guarantees from the Kremlin for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, to refrain from military buildup in Kaliningrad, and to halt Russian adventurism and aggressive military maneuvers in the region. Russia has shown a willingness to cooperate with the West so long as their strategic interests are represented, as evidenced by their key role in the Iran nuclear deal and in the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. In an open letter to François Hollande following the recent attack in Nice, Putin said, "Only united action can defeat terrorism." It is not a stretch to imagine that with a plan which represents Russia's interests as well as NATO's, that cooperation will be possible. Should NATO let go of its saber-rattling in the Baltics, and it absolutely should, for no good will come of it, Russia could prove an invaluable partner in solving these global crises that affect us all. Now, my teammate Danielle will expand on the economic dimensions of our proposal.
Thank you, Tony. Now I'd like to direct your attention to economic considerations. The recent decision of the US and EU to extend sanctions for another 6 months puts us no closer to obtaining a permanent, prudent solution to Russia's transgressions in Ukraine. Rather, it runs the risk of embroiling the US in a dangerous game of escalation. In examining the timeline of the Ukraine conflict, there emerges a distinctive pattern. Each time the West threatens or implements either a military buildup or economic actions against or harmful to Russia, Russia responds with increased military action in Ukraine or counter-sanctions on the West. This most recent Western policy outcome is merely another iteration of the same unsustainable US policy, inflammatory actions aimed at deterrence and punishment of Russia. Russia will not change course unless given a viable incentive to do so. The US is currently in a position of strength to do just that. Russia's Ukrainian transgression stems from the underlying reality that Russia is reacting from a position of weakness. Russia is a declining power marred by a weak economy with ingrained structural problems that will continually plague it if reform is not implemented soon. This still holds for the Russian petrostate. Even if oil and gas prices continue their moderate rise over the next year, then extension of sanctions will continue to isolate Russia's economy and give Putin the ability to make a tangible enemy out of the West that distracts the Russian populace from the long-run economic issues Russia will continue to face, from lack of diversification, high levels of corruption, weak property rights, risk of stagnation, and low levels of spending on research and development. The continued display of regional Russian military might in Ukraine has given Putin an excuse to infinitely delay any reforms aimed at economic modernization, diversification, and structural reform. Putin's reactionary foreign policy is economically, socially, and politically unsustainable in the long run, as is already evident in the recent domestic challenge Putin has faced from Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov. And the current economic situation of Russia, which is characterized by sustained inflation, decreased real income, depleted reserve funds, devaluated currency, and further contraction of the economy this year. Russia is not a threat to the U.S. economically or militarily, as Tony has explained. It is a weakening power whose leader has hinged his personalist rule on achieving legitimacy through reckless behavior in the near abroad. If we take this option away by ending further military buildup and extension or harshening of sanctions, Putin will be forced to look inwards for a source of legitimacy to perpetuate his rule. Otherwise, he risks demise, a collapse that would create a power vacuum liable to engender further instability in the region. For the West's part, cracks in the resolve of the United Western Front are already appearing, particularly concerning the extension of sanctions. The recent EU decision to extend sanctions until January of 2017 was met with greater opposition than when sanctions were first renewed in December of 2015. Europe's economy has begun to feel the effects of sanctions imposed on Russia, particularly the sectoral sanctions on energy, finance, considering Europe's reliance on energy imports from Russia, as well as Russia's importance as Europe's third largest trading partner. For these reasons, EU countries such as Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Hungary have questioned the sagacity of extending sanctions. EU officials, including the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Federica Mogherini, have stated that come December 2016, when sanctions will expire, extending or increasing sanctions further will face fierce opposition and require recalibration of the EU's foreign policy. A disunited EU means a disunited Western Front, and so limitations on how much damage the US alone can inflict on Russia's economy should the EU opinion mobilize against continued punishment of Russia. Therefore, without the EU, Western sanctions will not be successful, and the current economic arm of Western foreign policy will fall flat, thereby putting the West no further ahead than it was before the sanctions were extended for a second time. Instead, the U.S. must seek a recalibration of its own economic policies toward Russia, now, before the Western Front fragments come the lapse of the sanctions extension. The U.S. and the West more broadly are in a position to negotiate from strength. We must engage in rapprochement with Russia by offering Putin a way of saving face while stemming the economic collapse of Russia, which is sure to come should Russia's economic woes fester any longer, regardless of sanctions and oil prices. To do so, the U.S. must enable Putin to secure popular legitimacy through economic growth by reintegrating Russia into the liberal economic order. This entails Russian accession into the OECD and enforced adherence to WTO principles, as well as a series of bilateral agreements with the U.S. to improve investment relations and cooperation on geopolitical matters of vital interest to the U.S. In return, the U.S. would repeal sanctions in a stepwise manner. This modulated process of Russian economic reintegration would allow for Russian economic growth and reform in a stable, sustained, and regulated format. A prosperous and stable Russia would find no reason to engage in further military adventurism, and the region would achieve stability. We recognize that on the surface, this may appear to exclusively benefit Russia. This is not the case. We need Russia's cooperation in a host of pressing geopolitical matters, be it Syria and the Middle East, managing China's rise, non-proliferation of WMDs, or solving frozen conflicts, such as that in eastern Ukraine. However, we cannot simultaneously punish Russia while attempting to mend U.S.-Russian relations, which are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. Russia needs American assistance to modernize economically and become an influential part of the global economy, as well as gain access to American markets, something which would be mutually beneficial. Bringing Russia into the folds of global economic institutions is neither a concession to Russia nor a reward for Russia's recent transgressions. It is a prudent and calculated assessment of U.S. geopolitical needs. Therefore, Russia's declining military and economic state should be viewed first as a point of strength from which to negotiate with Russia, and second, as an opportunity for the U.S. to mend U.S.-Russian relations, so that our dual energies can be focused on matters essential to advancing and securing U.S. vital interests throughout the globe. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague Kent, who will discuss regional considerations.
Thank you very much, Danielle. The ongoing dispute between the international community and Russia regarding the legality or lack thereof of Russia's annexation of the Crimean region, as well as their covert military actions in eastern Ukraine, is fraught with a variety of specific regional concerns. However, the situation could prove to be an opportunity for the United States and Russia to reevaluate their current relations and potentially focus their efforts on solving more pressing international concerns, such as the Syrian civil war and the rise of the Islamic State. Though Russia's actions may seem reminiscent of Soviet-era behavior, they are indeed the actions of a desperate Russia, not ones of aggressive design. In reality, the decision to annex the Crimean region was informed by an understandable concern for the well-being of several vital Russian interests, such as maintaining control of the Black Sea Fleet, protecting populations of ethnic Russians, and defending against the expansion of NATO into Russian border states, i.e. Georgia and Ukraine. Following the NATO summit in Bucharest that took place in 2008, Russia has increasingly considered Ukrainian entrance into NATO to be an existential threat. And therefore, continued efforts to expand institutions such as NATO and the EU into this region are simply provoking more antagonistic reactions from Putin and his struggling economy. Russia's concern for populations of those considered to be ethnic Russians in ex-Soviet border states is not unreasonable. Ethnic Russians make up roughly 15% of Ukraine's total population and around 55% of the population in the Crimean region. That said, though a large amount of Putin's fuss over these populations is most likely a pretense for strategic annexation, it does hold water that Putin would be concerned for those populations that still align and identify themselves with Russia. Recent Ukrainian legislation aimed at making the government more inclusive for these populations of ethnic Russians by making Russian an official second language in the country was actually struck down, distressing both these populations and many Russian officials. That said, it is entirely plausible for these populations we consider an understandably vital interest for Putin in the region. Another regional interest for Putin is maintaining control of the Black Sea Fleet docked in the port of Sevastopol. This port is especially significant for Russian regional interests due to the access to warm water seas provided by the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits. Without it, Russian naval options would be severely restricted. Following the Maidan Revolution, Russia saw this destabilize Ukraine as a potential liability for maintaining control of this incredibly important regional asset. The Maidan Revolution itself is also an understandably concerning source of regional distress for Putin in that, following the removal of President Yanukovych, Ukraine showed ominous signs of destabilization, including a 70% drop in the value of the Ukrainian hryvnia since 2014. Given these signs of unrest and potential authoritarian nature of many other border state governments, the argument can be made that Putin viewed Ukraine's destabilization as a potential spark for Arab Spring-style revolutions throughout Eastern Europe. From this perspective, quelling the potential for the growth of this revolutionary fervor can most definitely be seen as a vital regional interest. Continuing this pattern of regional instability, the pervading corruption and cronyism in Ukraine, as well as many other Russian border states, on top of the damage done to Ukraine's economy by the irresponsible governing of Yanukovych, are issues that the EU cannot contend with given its miasma of other current issues, such as Brexit and the Greek economy, to name a few. Ukrainian entrance into the EU would not only further exacerbate relations with Russia, it would strap another sizable burden to the institution that it does not have the time nor the resources to handle in an effective manner currently. Following the NATO summit that took place in Bucharest in 2008, in which the topic of Georgian and Ukrainian entrance into the institution was discussed, Russia began an increasingly aggressive stance against the idea. However, President Saakashvili of Georgia was quite open to the idea and saw entrance into NATO as one of the main goals of his administration. Seeing this expansion as an understandable threat to its borders, Russia began to ready its forces for a potential invasion of Georgia, which eventually occurred following a conflict between the semi-autonomous Ossetian states and Georgia, and the Georgian military forces. Backing the Ossetians, which Putin saw as a group of ethnic Russians and therefore Russian regional interest, Russian military forces clashed with those of Georgia and ultimately recognized the Alsatian region as being independent of the Georgian government. This conflict is one of many examples as to why the entrance of Russian border states into institutions such as NATO only serves to further exacerbate regional tensions. Current Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev's remarks in 2011 to Russian soldiers at a base in Vladikavkaz further prove this point. Quote, "If you, Russian soldiers, had faltered back in 2008, the geopolitical situation would be different now, and a number of countries which NATO tried to deliberately drag into the alliance would have most likely already been part of it now." In this statement, Medvedev makes very clear the connection between NATO encroachment and Russian hostility. Though Russia's recent actions most certainly violate several binding treaties regarding the legitimacy of international borders, and for this reason cannot go unpunished, current U.S. policy has shown our commitment to liberal international order and done a considerable amount to persuade Putin that similar actions in the future would be against Russia's best interests. The United States is currently negotiating from a position of strength, and a policy of increasingly aggressive posture will only invite the potential of an increasingly aggressive response. In addition to this, continued aggressive posturing by the United States and the West also provides Putin with a convenient scapegoat in terms of him being able to paint the West as being the source of Russia's issues, as opposed to actually addressing them. Moreover, Western-leaning democracies are becoming more and more commonplace in this region, another sign that a solid presence of like-minded states exists in the region, and that the United States and NATO are working from an advantageous position. From this standpoint, further NATO expansion is simply unnecessary, as potential Eastern European inductees would provide little to no increase in resources and would only stand as a symbolic gesture of aggression against Russia. For these reasons, going forward, the United States should continue to condemn the annexation itself. However, we must also realize that the Crimean region will not be returned to its original status. In any future negotiations, we must agree to avoid allowing Russian neighbor states entrance into institutions such as NATO and the EU, not as a concession to Putin, but simply as an act of prudence to avoid further inflaming regional tensions. Going forward, if Russia agrees to honor Minsk II stipulations of a ceasefire in the region, respecting international borders, allowing special status for Donbass region, cooperation in the provision of aid, and in general putting an end to his aggressive actions, our team suggests that the United States should be willing to consider gradually loosening and then potentially fully removing the sanctions placed against Russia. As these sanctions are lessened, the United States can work to integrate Russia more into the world economy, allowing them to heal from their economic glut, and then opening the door to collaboration on issues such as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, humanitarian efforts, and conflicts such as that in Syria. And now I cede the floor to our team leader, Isabel.
Thank you, Kent. To sum up, the United States should approach negotiations with Russia with the following strategy. The U.S. should continue state building in Ukraine, specifically addressing issues of corruption, but we should also promise Russia no American interference in future Ukrainian elections, no inclusion of Ukraine into NATO, and no inclusion of Ukraine into the European Union. We should halt NATO military buildup in Europe and the Baltics at the levels agreed upon at the recent Warsaw summit. And the U.S. should gradually reduce the economic sanctions that have been imposed in exchange for the following Russian concessions. Russia should agree to a complete implementation of Minsk II. Russia should promise ending aggressive moves and ending subversions of the politics of ex-Soviet states. And Russia should promise to not nuclearize the European nation of Kaliningrad, which is a move that Putin has been threatening to do. Team A is not arguing for a solution wherein we carve the globe into different spheres of influence. On the contrary, negotiations from a position of strength is a recognition that the United States can retain influence in the Eurasian region, but that this must be done prudentially. While we want democracy to be cemented in ex-Soviet states, ensuring their long-term stability, we recognize that this must be a gradual and long-term process. And we recognize that moves such as financing the Orange Revolution can have counterproductive consequences. In turn, Russia must deter from funding right-wing nationalist parties in Europe. We're also not serving Russian interests before our own. A stable and stronger Russia is an American interest. We want a Russia that is so integrated into the world economy that the costs of aggression outweigh any potential benefit. And this is possible while simultaneously reducing Europe's dependence on Russian energy. We want a domestically stable Russia, one that stops using the United States as a scapegoat and starts holding its leaders accountable. And we want a Russia that acts as a responsible stakeholder of the liberal international order. Let us not turn our success in Ukraine to a global failure. Now is the time to start negotiations from a position of strength. Thank you.
So before we move on to questioning of Russia Team A, I just want to thank all of our teams for a really wonderful job today. All of our experts and all of our guests, Dave Dewey, Mary Jo Gibson, and particularly Gordon Singer, who, again, one last time, a quick round of applause. With that, questions for Team A?
Sure, so I'll head off. Really enjoyed the presentation. I thought there were a lot of clear points there. But in terms of questions, it seems like your strategy is based on this kind of grand bargain with Russia, where you're going to make a series of concessions, and Putin and the Russians are going to make some concessions, and it's going to lead to a better outcome. But there's a couple of tensions in your prescription. The first is you guys simultaneously sell, not reinforcing the Baltics, lessening sanctions, etc., as kind of good ideas, regardless of whether Putin actually backs up and does what you want in exchange. So I'd like you to walk me through this scenario where your offer doesn't work, where you saying, okay, Ukraine won't be part of the EU, okay, we won't try to reverse Crimea, okay, XYZ, and Putin says, okay, that's nice, but I'm going to keep doing kind of what I'm doing. And by the way, you didn't even mention, militarization of the Arctic or things like that. So if that happens, I'm interested to know what you guys would then prescribe. It seems like you might prescribe what this team over here is saying. And really what you guys differ on is your optimism of whether Putin will accept your deal. And if he doesn't, it's unclear to me, are you going to keep the sanctions and these types of things going, or are you going to get rid of them? Because it would seem like you would have to keep them on, otherwise why would he even make any concessions, because he knows that stuff's going to go away? Or you're also saying, well, we want to get rid of that stuff anyway because it's not a good idea. So you have this mix of policies that should be followed regardless of what Putin does, but then those policies are also supposedly your bargaining chips to get him to change his behavior. So explain to me what happens, A, while you're convinced that he's going to make this deal, and B, if he doesn't make this deal, how does your policy then differ from Team B?
Thank you for your question. I think it highlights an important part of our strategy that maybe did not come as clear when we were presenting it, and it's that we want a gradual and stepwise approach. So it's a concession for concession. We think that a slight decrease in sanctions can result in further cooperation with Putin. Maybe he agrees to part of Minsk. And then limitation of NATO, he can agree with another part of Minsk. So it's not like full step approach. What was the second part?
The main question is just, so that's ideal, right? That's what you'd like to have happen. What if he says no?
Oh, yeah.
What happens?
We also think that the Ukraine crisis has been a very long and costly war for Russia, and that we see several signs in their economy that they are faltering. And we also think that Putin's international posture right now, and as we showed 2 newspaper articles from the last week, where he's showing that he wants to cooperate with the West, are signs that he is willing to enter diplomatic table and start talking with the United States.
Respectfully, Isabel, we still want to know the answer. What if Putin says no?
We continue sanctions and we continue our current buildup.
Next question?
Well, we talk about NATO, we're talking about liberal democracies, of course, what people think matters. This is a very uneasy time for many of the NATO nations. We saw that in the Brexit vote. We see that concerns for the terrorist attacks throughout Europe. And I mean, candidly, a lot of folks in Europe are very concerned about, particularly the further east that they are, about what Putin is doing. And so, Ken, in your analysis, in your presentation, you talked about an assumption of all of this is a respect of international borders. So how do these leaders go back to their people and address this point that, in 1994, Russia was part of an agreement, along with the United States and Great Britain, And it had to do with the movement of nuclear weapons back to Russia, and with that came a legal statement that they would recognize the territorial borders of Ukraine. And obviously this military action where they seized Crimea is in direct violation of something that they signed. So at a time when there is so much angst in the European Union and NATO, how do these leaders go back and say, yeah, but in this case, we think that engaging them diplomatically is the best route? How do you go about doing that, given the fact that they violated what they put down in law?
Well, the violation of these borders, I mean, it really kind of speaks to the whole, like the desperation that Russia's going through. Their economy's hurting, and their military, I mean, they have a strong military, but they're not in a position to really defy any sort of NATO incursions if we were to decide to do that. But going off of that, these leaders they have to go back and tell their populations that Russia is continuing to defy these borders.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second, just to sort of frame the question? And so I took a brief last week on this issue, and it was one graph that really caught my attention, and it showed Putin's popularity in Russia. Most of it you'd expect correlates with when the economy was doing well, Putin was doing well. He had a period in 2011 where he dropped in popularity. Their economy's in shambles right now, and Putin's popularity has never been stronger. So in relation to responding to that question, in recognizing, even if I accept your premise that Russia is desperate, given what Putin's decision-making has been, and politicians generally respond to their popularity, convince me why, the folks of Europe are going to be convinced by the leaders of Europe, and B, why Putin is going to give up on a strategy that's continuing to give him strong popular opinions.
Well, while it may continue to give him strong popular opinions domestically, the sanctions and the responses by the West that we put into place are continuing to degrade the Russian situation in general. And though, I mean, Crimea is an incredibly popular region in Russia. Like, people refer to it as being like the Florida of Russia for vacations and things like that. So the Russian population is definitely very happy to have that back in the fold of Russia. But at the same time, these actions, going forward, if you were to continue doing this, it's not in their best interest.
But so you think they're going to get at a decision point, and he's going to decide to accommodate rather than take more bellicose action? That's your premise.
Well,
Isabel, I'm sorry. Did you want to get in?
Yeah. So our approach is that when Putin came to power, he had his legitimacy was based on a kind of an economic populism, and he was paying off people, and it was this type of legitimacy. And then when the oil prices started falling, he started relying on this very belligerent and aggressive form of domestic legitimacy, which feeds into kind of this popular narrative in Russia of anti-Americanism. But this form of legitimacy is not sustainable on the long run. And if he continues pursuing it, he knows that there's a point at which poverty and the current situation economically is going to be so bad that he is going to go down. So we think that this is the right moment where he has recognized that stance, and he will try to return to that old form of legitimacy. And that's why we want to integrate Russia into the world economy.
I think regarding the popularity ratings, Putin has recently embarked on increasing censorship of what gets filtered through to the populace and the propagandistic campaigns that he's been on. And there is evidence supporting that those Russian polls regarding his popularity are entirely truthful of the actual fact, and that they overinflate his popularity.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay, building on all that, Russian history features all sorts of things like economic collapse, revolutions, separatist bids. You guys wish Russia well, you want it law-abiding and integrated in the world economy, but what if one of those or more than one of those three things happen? What's your policy stance?
I think regarding collapse of Russia, that's part of the reason why we really want to get them started on a trend towards being integrated into the liberal international order. If we get them into the economic order to accept these reforms that are required to be part of the WTO and the OECD, I mean, Russia just joined the WTO in 2012, that's still within Putin's presidency, then that in and of itself is disincentivizing such aggressive behavior in the future, knowing that the economic states will fall out if Russia decides to embark on a future aggressive path.
Yeah, but what happens if it does happen? Economic collapse, revolution, or separatist bid within Russia?
I think that would lead us to re-question our whole strategy depending on the outcomes of what is happening. And at the root of the issue, what I see is that we need to slowly help the Russian population get over this kind of notion that all of their ills and problems are the problem of the West. And there's also this ideological issue where kind of culturally Russia has an emphasis on the importance of a strong state, while the United States has sees the importance of human rights and kind of this liberal order. And it is only by working together with the country instead of constantly antagonizing that we will be able to integrate them into our current world order. Even if there continue to be revolutions and there continue to be changes in the dynamics of the country, we think it's a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I think such a power vacuum that you sort of posited as a thing is exactly what we are trying to avoid with this approach, because we're in this position of strength over Russia. We don't want to push them to the brink. And I think that the way the narrative is currently being spun in Russia is that it's Western imperialism, that's Western encroachment. And if such a movement were to take place and depose Putin, I think it would be an anti-Western movement. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to avoid here. I think that's particularly why we have to take more of a stance where we're integrating Russia into the world economy, where we're making it want to be a part of this liberal international order, and where such a power vacuum would not be such a horrible threat to global security.
Great. I want to thank RussiaTeam A. I also want to thank Keith for his wonderful job preserving this as a historical document moving on. And I will let everyone know when it's available online. But thanks to all, both our experts, all of our students, all of our visitors, and we'll see you again next year.